Good afternoon and welcome to Pre-Harvest Evaluation of Early Planted Soybean. What have we learned? My name is Claire Weinzerl and I'm the Communications Manager at the Illinois Soybean Association. Thank you all for bearing with us as we handled some tech issues getting started earlier. Please join me in thanking our corporate partner, DEKALB Asgrow, for sponsoring our webinar today. If you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to type them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and we will answer those following the presentation. If you are a certified crop advisor, you should have provided your CCA number during registration, and if not, we will be displaying the QR code at the end of the presentation today to obtain 1 CEU credit in crop management. Our team will be sure to submit CCA numbers as well following today's webinar. There will also be some poll questions featured during the webinar today, so please be sure to engage in those as they become available. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Jessica Hurtis. Jessica is a technical agronomist with DEKALB Asgrow Seed, supporting 17 counties in southeastern Illinois, and has been in her role for 8 years. She went to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and earned both her bachelor's and master's degrees in crop sciences, focusing her thesis in soybean pathology. Jessica grew up on a corn, soybean, and wheat farm in Clay County, and today lives in Richland County with her husband Calvin and 2.5-year-old son Sawyer. Today, Jessica will be presenting pre-harvest evaluation of early planted soybean. What have we learned? With many bean planters rolling before the corn planters were out, there are some key learnings taken away from 2021 so far. Let's take some time to discuss the early season risks, benefits, and management factors to pay attention to before we get through harvest and begin making plans for our 2022 crop. Please join me in welcoming Jessica.
Poll question. So Claire, if you want to pull up. And we are recording, so even better. Do you want to pop up this poll question? Beautiful. So this first question, when did you start planting your soybeans this year? So if you're able to sit in front of a computer or on your device without driving, be safe. Feel free to share your experience in planting soybeans this year. We'll spend about 20 seconds here to get your feedback. Okay, here are the results. So about 73% of our audience here has planted in April, which I would definitely say that would be the majority. A few did get a little wild and have some fun in March, and then May, of course, we were in that realm as well. So a very kind of a little bit skewed to the later side here, or a quote later. But really the purpose of this question is to really put it into relative terms. So March isn't necessarily early, and May isn't necessarily late. I think we really need to get away from getting too hung up on a calendar date versus really trying to plant timely versus focusing on just that early card. It's not about being the first planter in the field. We've got to pay attention to our soil conditions, our weather forecast, investing in some of these inputs that really help us with the management part. And again, last year is always a learning situation. We're going to learn a lot from this year, but we can't get too hung up on one single year of experience as well. More use it for the insights to base our planting timing and really capturing that opportunity. So we'll close that out. All right, and we'll keep moving. So I'll get right into the agenda. So what are we going to be talking about today? Let me get my slides moving here. Oh, whoops. Okay, so I'm kind of a dork, I guess, and I like to keep things light. I like pop culture, so you're going to see some references. And I think as we experienced early soybean planting or timely soybean planting this year, we could frame it up with a pretty popular movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And who doesn't love some Clint Eastwood in our lives? So across these tiers that we saw, I think we can definitely say it's a good initiative. The reason we're all here is to learn how to do it better. But things like weather, seed treatment, population ranges, our pre-effects and early season weed management, and then just what's going on mid-season, what's going on today, how does that all feed into the system, and again, set us up for the most success in the decisions we're going to make this fall once the combines start rolling at harvest, especially. So we'll dive right into it and start with the good. I'm an optimist, so let's get right into the good. And again, some more of this pop culture, having Clint Eastwood and Will Ferrell on the screen. Hopefully I can be friends with most of you in the room here today. So why do we keep doing it? There's some strife, there's some heartache, there's some lost sleep at night, but why do we go down this road? And it's really all about yield. So this mechanism of higher yield potential early. I do have a citation there, a reference to a really good article. We'll share it at the end as well, but this soybean research info put it all together for most of the tiers I'm going to be speaking to in this presentation today. However, this is a really nice data point, and I think it resonates with us very well on where that yield is coming from. Where are we driving this from, and how is that soybean physiology, coming into play here? So generally, we're adding about one main stem node every 3.7 days. So just shy of every 4 days, we're gaining a main stem node once that first trifoliate appears through the time that the first, our seed development begins. So, through that blooming process as well. So, putting that in perspective, if we delay our soybean planting by 7 days for no good reason, a lot of times it's a rainfall and we decide to hold off, and that's the right thing to do. But if we lose 7 days, we're essentially limiting ourselves by about 2 nodes, through that growing season, through that optimizing of the performance early. So as we think about that early planting and the good conditions during that seed fill, we can really take advantage of some top end yield, and again, grab that experience. I would say, in years past, the common comment has probably been 10 bushel advantage, not a promise, not a guarantee, but a lot of insights as we've thinking about capturing more of the sunlight throughout the growing season can go a long way. And it really comes down to that first yield component of soybeans, the number of plants per acre, and then of course those nodes per plant carrying the pods. Another faction of that is really in our genetic decisions. We've come in our soybean breeding and progression as we think about modern varieties. There's some very good research done back in 2014 that indicated just modern varieties versus some more traditional older varieties. We pick up about a week earlier flowering dates, in addition to an extra 2 weeks in the reproductive stages. So as we think about that comes down to yield again. We need growth, we need flowering. Getting that reproductive stage maybe a little bit wider or broadened, it gives us more flexibility with our fungicide applications and other aspects there. So that management piece goes a long ways, again, going back to these base genetics, really driving that yield potential through our modern soybean varieties. So another added benefit of taking advantage of this high yield potential early. So here is a graph, speaking to a little bit broader audience. I hope there's a couple of folks from Northern Illinois on the call still. I didn't scare everyone off by the delay, but this is a nice chart that really kind of breaks down some hard data on the days to flowering by planting date. So you can see that bottom axis, we have everywhere from early March through late June or mid-June basically. And this is 3 years of conglomerate data, including 2021. So 2021 back to 2019 is represented here. And you can see a nice linear regression as you see the days to flower, they really decrease as we get into this later planting date. And that's why, of course, we make population decisions later season to, again, get more plants per acre to compensate for the lower number of nodes, because we have less days to get to that flower stage, obviously. That being said, I know a lot of these March beans did sit in the ground for over 20 days in a lot of cases. So that can be kind of skimmed off there, but intuitively, we can definitely see we're taking advantage of the growing season with some of these earlier planting dates. And beyond the yield. So again, yield is the key driver, but some other reasons that we plant early include the application strategy. So, a lot of times I hear a grower say, maybe 5 years ago, once we get done planting our beans, then it'll be time to bounce back into the corn and start side dressing, right? I think, again, this gives us some flexibility management by, starting earlier with beans, waiting for that soil condition to be even more ideal for corn. We know it can be a little bit pickier than beans on that soil temp, and uniformity on emergence is so much more important with corn. Putting that off a little bit, and by the time we get done, we can still be strategic between our corn and soybean nutrient management as well, in addition to our herbicide flexibility there too. There's challenges, there's limitations, of course. I'm an Asgrow agronomist, so we are built on the Extend Flex and Extend system, and there's some date cutoffs due to the Illinois label. That being said, taking advantage of getting that herbicide down earlier. I'm going to talk about weed management in depth in a few more slides. And of course, starting earlier, we've got to start clean and spray clean. So starting earlier in the system, having more flexibility to be strategic, and of course, adapting to our growing condition conditions is all the better as we think about a solid weed management system there too. An additional benefit includes a timely fall. So, depending on where things go, fall can go really fast or be extremely slow, depending on when that combine is able to start rolling in the field. So, thinking about your relative maturity, your maturity group of your soybeans and your corn can both allow a strategy as well. There's a lot of academics, a lot of professionals, Dr. Belo, several folks, Sean Conley up with the Cool Bean group, doing a lot of work, and their data is definitely promoting planting a fuller maturity group soybean. I do have a little bit of insight at the end of the presentation as well on that front. But if you're wanting to play in that camp, stepping outside of your typical maturity zone and targeting it for that early planting date, again, to capture more sunlight, maybe have a fuller season maturity to put a few more nodes on there throughout the growing season, this allows that. So having that earlier planting date, spreads that out, gets us to maturity without worrying about that first frost. I would say other jobs. So obviously, especially this week, we will have an abundance of water, and that's going to be our limiting factor on soybean growth and development and finishing strong. I think we're going to see some pods being aborted due to just soil oxygen and the prolific amount of moisture where roots are not able to get that necessary oxygen. So fall dirt work, talking about tiling, drainage, things like that are going to be extremely important. So there's multiple reasons and avenues as we think about, the benefits of early soybean planting. And one I didn't include specifically, I don't like to plan for, is just generally the convenience of replant with soybeans, especially comparing to the tough decisions we have to make sometimes with corn replant decisions. We know it can, where do we start to tear it up? Where is the stand too thin? How am I going to disrupt the crop that's come up, and what's going to come up and be a volunteer and be essentially a competition for the next planting? So again, and what's that effective population and planting date on the yield of the corn? So with beans, in general, we can drop the planter in at an angle, thicken them up to a desired population, and making sure we have the adequate ground cover, not only for weed management, but that yield optimization as well. So yeah, a lot of good benefits there. I think we've, been able to be strategic with a lot of these things, but thinking about next fall's dirt work or next fall's opportunities, I think we can establish a few more different directions with our early planting objectives there too. So talking about those populations with that replanting in, let's go into another poll question. And this question will be, at what population range did you plant your early or more timely soybeans? So we've got options of 80,000 to 100,000, 100,000 to 130, 130 to 145, and 150 to 165, and then 165 plus. So my slide versus the poll is a little bit skewed off, but you can kind of capture the range a little bit tighter through this poll question. So we'll spend about 15, 20 more seconds before we look at the results here. All right, a few more seconds. There we go. All right, so very, a nice bell curve. And this is what I kind of would have assumed as well. So, about 26% of the participants in that 100 to 130 range, majority of the group, about 50% of you in the 130 to 145. A few more, 20% in the 150 to 165. So and then 165 plus, there's a handful there, or just a couple there. So, there's really no wrong answer here. And I did want to break this down. There's several data sources. If you look for optimizing population on soybeans, in general, you're going to find that a final stand of 100,000 per acre in a high yield environment is optimizing our yield. And in a lower yield environment, 135 is kind of that sweet spot as well. However, that's our final stand. So we're talking about what the planter setting is through this poll question, and that's the $1 million question, right? How much stand could we lose? What are those limiting factors going to be? With early planting and perfect conditions, the general guidance is to err a bit lower to maintain standability and really, make sure this time of year we're not seeing too much legginess. But again, no one has the perfect answer there. But I think looking at the forecast, our drainage of our fields, if we're going to be planting, if it's time to go, the soils are dry, the conditions are great, but there's, a chance of rain in 7 to 10 days. We might need to bump that up if we just absolutely have to get the seed in the ground. So I think it's, there's some flexibility there. through that, we definitely need to be paying attention to our varieties. So product standability ratings, if you're going to be planting earlier and maybe, going through those latter two, the 150, 165 range and plus, you definitely want to pay attention to standability. Make sure we're not going to have weak knees this time of year. We got a lot of rainfall. Even products with good standability ratings are starting to squat in some places after 7 to 10 inches of rain in my territory specifically. So it's very intuitive. There's not a bulleted approach here with population, but I know as you think about setting your planter, we've got to be thinking a few steps ahead just to make sure we end up with that ideal final stand without having us overseeded as well. So let's talk a little bit about what robbed our population and what we can start to do to maybe mitigate some risk as we think about next year. So the first thing is weather. And, the biggest thing about weather is that it's one of those uncontrollables. Most of the conversation today is truly based around things that we can control. They're going to be our decisions, but Mother Nature is going to throw at us what Mother Nature throws at us. And we have to be agile and adapt and, be kind of a optimist to keep chugging along. If farming was easy, everybody would be doing it, right? And weather's usually the reason for that strife. So let's just kind of go back through the first 3 months of our planting conditions. And this is trying to speak very broadly. Hopefully something resonates within you here. I tried to grab a couple of the key bullet points where most of us did experience this throughout the season. So in March, it did seem like that early part of March, we had great conditions. Soils were cool, but they were dry. So there were some folks that put the planters in the ground, didn't go crazy, didn't get too wild, but started to get things calibrated, get things rolling. There's a lot of anhydrous going on in that second week of March. And there was a decent amount of seed planted for the most part, but we were pretty cautious. No one finished the farm in general. However, between that latter part of March and the middle of April as well, especially going back to Easter weekend, that's when things really ramped up. The gates opened and planters were rolling everywhere. Dust was flying, right? That led us into some cooler conditions. Soils had started to warm up adequately, but we weren't, in an ideal, high quick emergence sort of scenario. And come April 20th, that's when the snow fell. So, we had snow. We were praying that snow would actually insulate some of our tiny soybeans that had pushed through and started to neck through because there were some below freezing temps. The soils were actually warmer than the air many days in that April, time frame later. And of course, that meant they were damp too. So we'll talk a little bit about seed treatments and what kind of protection we needed in those cases for some of these challenging conditions for the cool, wet soils. And then on May, again, Mother Nature threw us a curveball and gave us a frost on the 12th and the 13th. So there were some really cool nights. And, I think the least we can say is that beans are pretty darn resilient. They weren't 100% through all of these conditions, depending on what was thrown at us, but it's pretty cool to see just, how some of those really early planted beans relative to these conditions powered through. And I'm keeping you busy with polls. So we've got another poll question here for you personally, of y'all that are on here. What was the leading cause of stand loss for you this year in 2021? Yeah, we probably should have given you the option to select multiples of these, but I would just say the number one cause among these options here. All right, a few more seconds. All right, the poll is ended. So interesting. So, we had a little bit of disease, some chemistry damage, some frost and freeze, and then other. So, it'd be interesting what that other factor was for many of you. If you want to chat those in through the polls, I'd like to know just from my perspective that about 36% of you, I must have missed something important in this poll question. Yeah, very real for what some of the challenges we had this spring were. So thank you for contributing that. Let's dive into some of the causes and how do we, again, mitigate some of these issues that occurred this spring. Seed treatment. So, the benefits of seed treatment, I think we're all generally bought into them, but they're even more beneficial when it comes to early planting and planting at a more moderate or that lower population rate. You know, the pretty logical, of course, that we have less seeds out there, so we need to do a little bit more to protect those. So hopefully, you know, most of you that are in that 130 to 140 range and lower are fully utilizing a pretty loaded seed treatment program. For those of you in that higher range, if the cost might be off-putting, you're planting a little bit on the thicker side, say, you know, 165,000 plus, you could possibly look into the minimizing the inputs a little bit while maximizing your yield by reducing your seedling rates and using those seed treatments to protect. But again, at the end of the day, it's your planter settings, what you can sleep at night, knowing your acres and the productivity. But again, that seed treatment can help offset some of that cost through that additional protection in our final stands. So what seedling blights do we typically mess with or have to deal with early season? It includes everything from Pythium, Phytophthora, Fusarium species. These all cause a seedling damping off. And that's basically kind of, they wither up to nothing and, you know, kind of just go into a crispy little critter that melts away. And we can't always find it very soon if there's a lot of rain. In my part of the world this year, Pythium was probably the most common pathogen that we dealt with. It was lab confirmed. So here's a photo of just one of those examples. And right there at the neck at the soil line is where that was affected, damaged and killed the seedling and robbed a lot of stands and resulted in quite a few replants. Rhizoctonia is also an important one, but generally we don't see it unless our temperatures are on the rise. So a warmer soil condition in addition to those wet will cause rhizoc, and rhizoc is a little bit easier to distinguish on symptomology versus the other damping off blights due to the fact that it kind of causes a canker with some reddish brown color to it. So again, get out your disease compendiums to split hairs among them. But you know, the fungicide component of seed treatments is extremely valuable for these blights. And you can see the conditions that favor seeds. And a lot of these things do coincide with our early planting scenario. So that's really why that consideration is very important. You know, non-rotated acres, we have higher disease inoculum, plant stress. The tillage system, of course, goes back to heat and drainage. And, you know, just that general early planting cold stress that can really flip the switch with rainfall patterns. Additionally, within our fungicide right now, we're seeing a lot of SDS symptoms being expressed. However, for those of you that have experienced it, and probably many of us do know the life cycle of SDS and how it infects, is that it was back at planting, back at when those beans were just germinating and emerging when SDS actually infected. What we're seeing now is the toxin produced. Typically, it starts to show up after R3, intraveinal chlorosis and necrosis, like in the photo there. And with most industry seed treatments, SDS protection is, you know, comes as an upgrade option or an added cost. There are a couple of folks out in the countryside that do have a standard SDS protection in their seed treatments. I would just say, as a grower making decisions, making sure you understand what those actives are, what the efficacy, and especially what the consistency of those products are. There are some biologicals with some activity on SDS that may or may not be as effective or consistent as a hard chemistry out there. You know, as we worry or make decisions based off of SDS concerns and control, and what we're seeing right now, definitely be taking note of the fields with the history. If you see some SDS this year, making sure it is SDS and not a brown stem rot. Stem canker can actually cause similar symptoms, and there are some triazole fungicides from a foliar perspective that can cause a sort of adaptable effect out there. It does resemble SDS as well, so make sure it's SDS. And if it is does come down to that, then you start to have a history. So you need to manage that field a little bit differently. That might come into this upgrade option or a higher tier SDS protection, including host tolerance. So knowing your product's tolerance to SDS as well. This is a chart that actually, you know, feeds into some impacts of Olivo and Saltro. So I stole this directly from the Illinois Soy Summit slide deck that Dr. Kluetsky from at the time U of I had presented on 2 products that are used for SDS control. You know, again, use what you're comfortable with, you know, your products, and work with your trusted advisor to choose the product. But based off of his data, you know, he really focused in and honed on Olivo and Saltro due to the consistency of their performance and protection in the data. So use that for what it's worth. But basically what we're looking at in SDS environments, both of these products are very efficacious in protecting the roots from SDS infection not only from a root rot perspective, but also that foliar disease, that toxin production in the late season. As we look at yield in the blue part on the right, I guess I could get a little pointer kind of keep us grounded here. So there was a significant difference and an improvement, of course, in yield performance over the base fungicide that did not contain SDS protection. So there is value, especially where there is a history of the pathogen. I would definitely encourage you to re-watch the Soy Summit video. It's called the Seedling Disease Presentation. So find that one on the ISA website because you'll learn actually that SDS isn't directly correlated with planting date. So it's a part of the conversation here with our early beans, but it's more correlated with the environments of early planting. And I myself have walked double crop fields that had heavy SDS pressure in the past due to the cool, wet conditions in the soil at planting and at emergence. So keep that in mind. It's not only limited to SDS is not only an April pathogen or a disease. We can see it in May plantings. So again, we've got to do our best to mitigate risk, choosing tolerant varieties and using a higher tier seed treatment where there's a field history. So again, use your digital tools, whether it's a climate, whatever program you use, to maybe drop a pin, take a note, take a picture and say, hey, this field, we probably got to take it to a higher management or a higher seed treatment package next year. Moving into insecticides. So not many people on the poll spoke to insecticides being a limiting factor. That being said, so I'll move it along pretty quickly, but every year we do experience something to a degree. I saw more seed corn maggot in my life or this year than ever in my life. So that was a new one. So again, the value of insecticide in our seed treatment package is absolutely there. Some conditions that do increase this insect pressure includes delayed planting into pasture, grassland, or CRP, lower managed environments that might have just more insect pressure and populations. And really one that I found a lot of coincidence with was planting into those high levels of decomposing organic matter, i.e. manure in a lot of cases, or green vegetation, sometimes with cover crops, as we think about those acres on the increase as well. So just something to keep in mind. There's a lot of value in the insecticide portion of the seed treatment packages that come fairly standard out there. But again, we think about post-emergence on soybeans as well, insect pressure. We can get slugs, and also, especially, I know moving north, there was quite a bit of bean leaf beetle with that characteristic little triangle on his back that can also transmit the bean pod mottle virus. So again, there is value in the systemic activity of the insecticide with some of those pathogens as well, or excuse me, those insects as well. I'll speak briefly to nematicide. Basically, today there is no hard chemistry protection for nematicides. Definitely know your pressure. If you suspect nematode activity or damage or pressure on your field, definitely send in soil cores, get those populations evaluated. But they aren't necessarily correlated to an early planting scenario. However, if we think about the roots being exposed in the soil for a longer amount of time, then it probably is going to coincide with the environmental conditions that promote SDS issues. So more to come on that. Just understand that the biologicals that are out there today for control and suppression, there are some differences among them, and sometimes they reduce populations through reproduction or adult activity, things like that. So just understanding that faction to set the expectation appropriately. The biggest part of seed treatment, I think, is the expectation of the activity of it. So, planting was a very spread out process, where we had seed treatments, we saw the value. But let's think about just, these products are not intended to stay in the soil for a long amount of time. It's definitely an emerging sort of management tactic. And so we've really got to set our expectations based off of how long we can expect these seed treatments to stay efficacious in a best case scenario. So very, moderate rainfall patterns, generally dry, pretty normal. We can get about 21 to 28 days of protection from a seed treatment on the seed, which is the best case. And usually, especially as we think about our early planting scenarios, our beans are sitting in the ground a little bit longer, and we get a few more rainfall patterns, maybe even with warmer conditions, is really going to start to degrade the active. So 14 to 21 days is fairly typical as we think about that full rate of control. There might be a little bit of a tapering off or tearing off at that 20 days plus. But again, we got to think about when our pests are emerging, the pressure, things like that. and setting that expectation appropriately. They aren't intended to be there forever for very good reason. So, you know, as we think about soybeans, you know, they can germinate and emerge at or below just 50 degrees. But what's the limiting factor there? It's the amount of time. So at 50 degrees, emergence typically takes about 15 to 20 days. So there's a lot of waiting. There's a lot of kind of nervous pacing as we think about waiting for the soybeans to come up out of the ground. And again, that ties back to that soybean seed treatment activity along with it. So we've had some really nice control in the past, and there's a lot of value to seed treatments. And again, thanks to my colleague, Jason Carr, there up at Roanoke, here's a couple of years of data evaluating the stand establishment. So for simplicity, this is across planting dates. The green line is treated seed, a fully loaded package, and the yellow bar is an untreated, or excuse me, the orange is untreated. So you can see across those planting dates from left to right, so you know, early March, mid-March, you know, mid-April, we can definitely see the separation between treated and untreated. So the value is there, especially in our early planting scenarios, but even we do still pick up where beans are coming out of the ground fairly quickly. There is maybe a 5% improvement in stand establishment, so less risk, but still the edge goes out to the seed treatment package. So that kind of wraps up the seed treatment component. Let's dive into this early season weed management conversation. So, you know, we're in a day and age where there's a lot of different trait platforms out there. So I'm not here to preach one way or the other, but we do need to keep some fundamental seed treatment, some fundamental weed management tactics in mind. So in my part of the world, we really try to stick to a start clean, spray clean, and stay clean objective. And so what does that mean? We really just want to keep the weeds from coming out of the ground, for lack of a better phrase, and really, you know, rely heavily on our overlapping residual programs. And we're not scouting for weeds anymore. We're looking at a calendar date, paying attention to our weather conditions, making sure we have highly efficacious actives down before those weeds start to push through. You know, we've started to experience, and if you follow the University of Tennessee, there's actually been some research recently posted where we have auxin resistant, both 2,4-D and dicamba, auxin resistant Palmer amaranth that were not managed using a glufosinate cleanup spray. So those are 3 of our posts being exhibited resistance to. So that's a really bad day. So we really need to change our mind state on post-emergence mentality. It's basically a train wreck waiting to happen. So that really reiterates using our residuals, our pre's, getting that chemistry down before the weeds are coming up. That being said, we also need to know our weed spectrum and the emergence pattern. So with earlier planting beans, we're not really matching up quite as closely as generally the beans are up before a lot of these weed species are really emerging. And you know, I have a table here that kind of gives a general look at it. You know, as we think about going from Rockford to Cairo, there's going to be some different timings in regards to soils and the emergence of different weeds in the system. However, we've really got to be identifying what's your driver weed. And I think we can all agree water hemp is in that realm, but you know, depending on your field, depending on your operation, we could be dealing with large seeded broadleaves, cockerburr, morning glory, mare's tail, and some other aspects. So again, knowing when that driver weed is coming up, when is it going to emerge? You know, looking at it may not be totally accurate for today's growing seasons and environment, but let's just say we're going to start to see water hemp on May 24th. If I have a clean field on May 17th and there's a rainfall event coming, you can bet your bet your bottom dollar that we're going to get that spray application made between that window to keep those weeds from coming out of the ground. So we don't want to see weeds anymore. It's not about driving around on a Sunday and looking for the weeds that are up. It's making sure the field's in a condition where the sprayer can get across it on a clean stance. And really, making sure your program is holding up. Within that realm is water solubility in getting products activated. So with early planting, usually that's not an issue. And actually, we'll get into this pre-conversation where it might have hurt us a little bit from a PPO stance. However, there's really good products out there with soil or residual activity for dry conditions. So we could experience more dry conditions, and if we don't get an activating rain, and some of these products take, 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch of rain, having something that's very water soluble, like an approved dicamba or an Outlook type of product, there's some really good efficacious control to keep us through those dry spells. That being said, there's some really nice, other pre's that can be used and residuals that can be used, whether it's a encapsulated acetochlor type of product, Zidua, Mahler, metribuzin. The options are very endless, but again, we just want to make sure we're targeting the weeds, making sure those residuals are staying overlapping in the realm of things. So knowing what your options are and where you can adapt to protect that weed management efficacy. So let's get into, a few of you did mention you had some pre-PPO herbicide damage, and I did walk several fields in my part of the world where, specifically the sulfentrazone type of products, there was some damage. It decreased stand and actually resulted in quite a few acres of replant in this part of the world, and I know to the north as well. So it can be tough to distinguish from Pythium, but when we see it across the field and it matches up with our spray pattern, it's pretty black and white as we think about those crispy little seedlings that unfortunately were in a lot of cases just necked right at the soil surface. We had a good layer of residual down. We had that pre-down. Some cases it was incorporated, and we had a cool rain, and that's what activated it, and that's what came in direct contact with those seedling necks. So remember that PPOs do provide excellent control. Most labels do indicate a level of crop safety, so keep that in mind. The biggest challenge is that the beans sat in the ground longer due to our growing conditions and environment, and we couldn't exactly predict when that activating rain was going to occur. So, there are some scenarios that I picked up where there was a little bit heavier PPO damage. So I actually have a prize opportunity for those of you in front of a computer. Get ready to type into your chat. I'm going to ask you a question, and the first person that answers it, I'll send you a Yeti mug. It's a nice one. So yeah, prize opportunity. Which tillage system typically showed more PPO damage this year? 15 seconds here. Okay, 5 seconds if you haven't typed in. Hopefully someone has. I want to get rid of this mug. All right, so yeah, maybe Claire, if you can look at the chat and capture who answered conventional tillage. So conventional, there is a higher likelihood of some damage being shown by PPO herbicides. But why is that? Because generally we correlate conventional tillage with being a little bit warmer, maybe a little bit drier, especially compared to a no or reduced till scenario. Also think about the amount of soil coming into contact with our seed or our seedling. The hypocotyl of those soybean seeds as they're pushing through was in much more direct contact with that chemistry in that regard over a reduced tillage situation where there was a little bit of residue, a little bit of insulation to kind of protect those seeds, for lack of a better phrase. Not saying that no-till had zero stand loss due to PPO damage, but in general, that conventional tillage is a little bit riskier in these really cool, damp conditions with a PPO, especially some of those stronger PPO products. They're just a little bit too hot for that scenario. So, this is kind of our first, what have we learned? What can we do sort of mitigation conversation? Probably a pretty general conversation is going to be using our PPO herbicides, especially those heavier ones, your XLT sort of products, with caution, or even avoiding them in early planted conventionally tilled soil. I'm not here to tell you to change your tillage operation. You know what works for your acre, but you might need to be a little bit strategic, especially if you're going in those earlier conditions that might be more prone to cool, damp, activating rains. That's going to be where we can alleviate some of that risk. Work closely with your retailer. Find, especially if you work through a custom app, work with a crop protection specialist to make sure we're keeping a good weed management program for the weed species that you're dealing with. But it might be kind of changing your timing as well. It might be starting clean with an early burn down, planting into that, and waiting for those beans to emerge or very close to emergence before spraying a very early post per se. And then following that with another overlapping residual, a little bit the weeds from coming out of the ground before we get to canopy. And I know that sounds ridiculous in some management aspects. So again, I'm just trying to help you think outside the box. But, and I'm sure in many cases, folks are saying, well, how much is that sort of program going to cost? Well, I can't tell you that. I'm definitely know our retail prices and application costs and all that fun stuff, but I would challenge you to think, would you rather pay for it up front to keep the weeds from coming out of the ground, or would you try to skimp by, spread things out as much as they could without damaging our stand early, and then putting us into a rescue scenario where we could have 6 inches of rain in August and a new flush of weeds that we're going to try to smoke and burn with some, some questionable chemistries that are only going to kill what they come into contact, and also damage our soybeans that are in our reproductive stage. So I think there's some things to consider. It may not be for a whole operation, but where we can manage maybe these early acres a little bit more strategically to take advantage of this top end yield, it might be something you think about, especially where we have to get our stands established. So what are we seeing now? So this is a cool picture that really represents what caused some stand loss. I think in a lot of cases we maybe made a call too early because beans are very, very tough. You can see we lost some growing points, especially too. But you can see in this photo specifically that cotyledon doesn't have quite as much frost on it, and that's really due to just the water content. So of course, the more water you have, the longer it takes to cool it down or heat it up. And in a lot of cases, we need 28 degrees for 3 to 4 hours to truly kill and freeze that seedling itself. And in a lot of cases, we skimped by and maybe had an hour and a half, 2 hours, or it didn't get quite down to 28. So it's pretty amazing how some of these beans were able to cope. I know not all of them did. We had a lot of black cotyledons, a lot of black hypocotyls that just got smoked off. But in a lot of cases, we did have more of a stand out there than one would have thought a day after the frost or 2 days after the frost. So it's still pretty amazing just how the mechanics of soybeans work. In a lot of cases, due to that, where the beans survived, what are we seeing today? We're finding some, and this is a good example of that. You can see it basically lost that main stem, but luckily we had those axillary nodes, those buds where the cotyledons actually were attached, and they kind of grew out and did their own thing. So it'll be interesting to see, there's several 4-bean pods on this bean specifically, how the standability, if this doesn't try to break off or snap, will do. But again, I'd rather, get us this far into the growing season, and, we're definitely in a yield component stage at this point, with the kind of the double branching, for lack of a better phrase. What else are we seeing? SDS. So it's definitely making an appearance. Got to shout out some very good influence on Twitter, a great source of information and insights. If you're in the area, you can follow people that are high contributors with great information. But again, it's very important, like I said, to take note of the severity in your fields, what fields have it. If you have it for the first time, you now have a history of it in your field. So we've got to be thinking about, managing those fields uniquely, like I mentioned in the seed treatment portion. And then finally, not a great picture of poor standability. One I described, with early planting beans, they have more nodes. They're generally taller, where early season conditions are promoting. They really stacked up this year, specifically in a lot of lower node branching. But even varieties with decent average standabilities could be, starting to get a little heavy and starting to squat and ready to fall with the next severe storm. So it's a great opportunity to review your planting rates, your field productivity, and your standability ratings, especially with the varieties. So be sure to pay attention to that. Every year is different. We don't want to be too emotional. And again, going back to the things that we control, we can't control a wet August. August and the spigot totally turn off, especially as we think about our corn crop. But beans are pretty tough. If they're squatting now, that doesn't mean that we're losing yield. We've just got to, kind of deal with it. And there might be a little bit more fuel spend, but I haven't heard of many people complaining about yielding 80+ bushel beans that are a little bit rank versus, beans that are flat at R4 and R5. So again, we've got to make some decisions to make sure we have the best standing beans possible and in the right scenario. So we're going to get into yield. This is kind of the fun part. What planting date, and we've got a poll question. I think this is the last one that I'll torture y'all through. Which planting date will yield the most in 2021? So we've got March, April, May, or June. What do you think the sweet spot for 2021 was? We'll give you about 20 seconds. All right. The results are in. So April, 75%. A few of you are betting on that March, and then May as well, 17%. So I don't know the answer, honestly. We'll talk through a couple of trials where we've done some planting date studies. There's a lot of them, especially with the increased interest early planted beans this year. But yeah, we will know until the combines truly run. So again, if you don't measure it, you can't control it. So be sure you're paying attention to those planting dates and the effect on varieties, and make sure you're comparing apples to apples. Comparing a certain maturity at early planting versus a fuller maturity at a later planting probably isn't going to give you the most insight for your farm for decisions next year either. So let's get into a little bit of data and insights. So again, I've got some information from Roanoke, Illinois, from Mr. Carr from our Bayer Focus site. And here's some node counts. So just looking at our performance potential, we know part of the soybean yield equation starts with plants per acre, nodes per plant, pods per node, etc. And of course, the beans per pod is really what, we want to see more of those 3 beans and 4 bean pods, obviously. However, we can look across planting dates here, again, from early March down to mid-June. And, there's a drastic difference in the number of nodes. Now, will this correlate to yield this year? Who's to say for sure? However, we want to have more nodes because, of course, that increases our potential. So it's a pretty good day. You can definitely see the differences in plant growth from March 10th to that June 7th. He's got a ways to go on node development, and the days are getting shorter. I just saw a social media post where I think tonight is the last night that the sun is going to be actual visible after 8 p.m. So again, our days are getting shorter. These beans are going to start to, they've got to go into reproduction mode and get those blooms set to at least have some contribution. And again, that goes to our population conversation where, we compensate for the less nodes with later season planting through our population. We bump up that population so we get the plants per acre to increase the nodes per acre. And here's a photo again, kind of speaking to the planting date. So we also think about our final stands too. So at the Roanoke location, their March planting date landed at about 6,000 per acre. So whether that's the right or wrong thing to do, that's pretty thin, right? But where we can manage weeds, it might be the sweet spot. You can see those nodes are really stacked up, and that plant has a lot of yield potential. Comparing it to, however, a May planting date with 122,000, which of course we know is going to be a really nice uniform stand with good ground cover. Is that population going to help those plants compensate in yield and affect that beans per pod sort of count as well? And again, I don't know. So more to come on just kind of these effects and how they're played through the population and the number of nodes. I do have a little bit of experience here from Southern Illinois. So we have a really great cooperator. We do a lot of plots in Southern Illinois and Richview, Illinois, which is just in the Mount Vernon area. Pitchford Elevator did a early planting, multiple planting date, true replicated plot scenario. So you can see at March 10, we've had our first planting date, May 15th, followed by May 15th. So pretty good stair step. I think we were a little bit limited by weather here. So we planted into ideal conditions and 168,000 across the board. You can definitely see this photo was taken about a month and a half ago. So the differences in vegetation, this was a planting error. So don't let that skew that planting date result. But we've been able to fly it with the drone, look at some imagery, and of course, the more green, the better as we think about ground cover. So that sweet spot definitely is April in this imagery that was brought to us by our Centera camera technology. But again, more to come. So it's just a really good replicated opportunity across our plots, which also opens up the conversation for the maturity conversation. So we think about, like I said, a lot of those academics, there's some really profound data supporting planting a fuller season soybean variety earlier on. Again, we can capture more of that daylight and have more growth, and again, put more nodes on the plant. But at the end of the day, we don't want ourselves killing frost either. So it's kind of finding that sweet spot, and is the risk worth the reward in a lot of cases. So we do have kind of give you some visuals of our March planting, April and May, comparing 35 XF1 Asgrow Extend Flex bean compared to 48 XFO. So these are both beans that stand really well. Again, there's great products out there. That's just what we have access to as a team. And you can definitely see differences in branching, noding, the pod loads are definitely there. And as we get into this May planting, you can definitely see the changes, the physiological changes based off of the amount of days to blooming, things like that. We're a little bit stretched out with those more intense sunlight days. So it'll be really interesting to see where yield goes on this front. Another interesting note is that we had some pretty timely rainfalls this week in southern Illinois, and this 4.8 variety is actually did put on a new cluster of blooms. So we also think about capturing some of that in a supportive year can make a little bit of a difference too on our yield calculations. But what's the differences in nodes? So we did take some node counts. I do want to thank my counterpart, Jamie Horton. She's based out of this area that supports that Richview area. She was out, maybe almost got heat exhaustion yesterday counting nodes for me for this presentation. But she kind of broke it down for me by the planting date and node count by variety or by maturity especially. So the green line represents our 3.5 bean. The blue line represents our 4.8, and you can see across these planting dates, these 4.8s do actually edge out the 3.5. Now, we didn't break it down and count 3 bean pod, 4 bean pod. We'll kind of, we can take that data point a little bit later once we get further into development. And again, as you think about separating the two with the May, we might even pick up a couple more nodes with these rainfalls this week. So again, I think, going back to the poll, we might be in a sweet spot with this 4.8 with an April planting this year, and pretty the 4.8 and the 3.5 with the March window. So more to come on that. This will be a really fun one to follow and see how those node counts and this growth follow into yield. So what have we learned? How do we kind of tie a bow on this conversation? What can we do better next year? And what do you have to account for that may not be within our control? So, kind of tying us back to the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's some good things, there's some bad things. And, I think we're definitely continuing to learn. But, as we look at the bad and ugly things, the things we can't control, of course, are driven through the weather or fixed once it becomes visible when we think about our mid-season management. So we've got to do our best this year to take the right notes to mitigate it for next year, especially as we think about SDS, other diseases, or even standability or varietal issues that come up later on. Again, I would say, definitely work with your agronomist, your sales team to, figure out the risk and outcome for next year, and just be sure to ask good questions, especially in these early realm. Now on to the good. So bringing Mr. Eastwood back. We've got great seed treatments. They're efficacious. I would just say, remember to set the expectation to make sure we're getting the beans out of the ground in a timely manner so that we get that full control from the seed treatment that at best is going to last 28 days, but more likely it's going to be more in that 21-day realm. Population. Choose the right variety, adapt your rate. Again, in general, I'd say we're planting plenty of beans, and we can definitely be strategic on optimizing our final stand. Just knowing what the limiting factor is going to make this a lot easier of a decision. But remember, 100,000 uniformly spaced plants on a high yield environment is optimizing our yield, and around 135 on a lower productivity is going to be that sweet spot. So how do we get there? How do we kind of wager where to get there is definitely up to Mother Nature, but that's kind of that guidance there. And then of course we've got solutions in weed management, but I encourage you all just to start clean, spray clean, and stay clean, and try to keep that pressure off of our post mentality the best we very can. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for your agility. This is kind of the conclusion of my presentation. Be sure to get out your phone and scan the QR code for one CEU in crop management. But I do want to make a few acknowledgments and a few good follows for Twitter for those of you that are on there. Myself, Jamie Horton, my counterpart, and definitely follow your regional DEKALB Asgrow pages. There's some really timely agronomic info delivered through them all. A big thanks to Jason Carr and Randy McElroy down in my part of the world. I'm sure many of you know him. Always good insights across the board from our Bayer team here in Illinois, especially. So thank you for joining me. I do have the QR code up again here if you didn't grab it. Now's a great time to put in some questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jessica. We're going to go ahead and begin taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question, go ahead and type it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Again, as Jessica mentioned, if you're a CCA, please feel free to scan the QR code on the screen to get your 1 CEU credit in crop management. And I will mention that in that open prompt you had, Jessica, Tyson Walters was the only one who responded conventional till. So Tyson, we have noted your name down and we'll be in contact with you to get your prize sent to you. All right, so I have a few questions here. If you're ready, Jessica, the first one is, what is your opinion on how early planting impacts seed bean quality, especially from a plant disease or seed germination point of view?
Yeah, so I've had this conversation before. I know most of our production plants that are out there kind of limit the amount of early season bean as we think about, I think a lot of it comes back to seed stock for that purpose with production acres. But as we think about quality and those things like that, that's a fair consideration. I haven't had enough experience evaluating, the seed quality itself. So I wouldn't say a hard yes or a hard no. Excuse me. So I would definitely say it's something we need to evaluate, paying attention to things like purple seed stain, other issues. It seems like we really lose a lot of quality when our harvest window is really spread out and we have those conditions that just promote poor dry down or wet and then dry. So maybe having a more timely harvest with the earlier bean could give us a little bit better quality and seed fill. But again, I don't have a hard line on that one. So that is a very fair question, something that we do need to keep an eye on to make sure we maintain that quality and germ.
All right. The tillage world keeps evolving. How do you define conventional tillage?
Very fair question, especially as we think about capturing carbon credits. Probably the big headline of the summer is that conversation when it comes down to tillage. I think about conventional tillage as a pretty, aggressive tillage path. So we're really reducing our residue. We're going several inches deep into the soil profile, and we're really fluffing up that ground, an effective pass that would be very comfortably eliminating weeds in that pass. So definitely, a minimum till is kind of that more of a vertical till, in my opinion, something that's just kind of a seed bed prep, but that conventional is definitely an aggressive pass in an effort to control weeds and also prep that seed bed.
Great, thank you. In regard to the ugliness of Olivo at emergence, would you recommend adding a biological to help mitigate the stress?
So that is something I failed to mention. I've walked in that conversation of sickly looking beans early. There is a phytotoxicity with Olivo. So that again, going back to that data from the Dr. Kowalski, in their data, it did not affect yield. So I think that's some good news. And we did see beans continue to come up and push through, even though those cotyledons were pretty crispy, yellow, had that halo effect for, the kind of commonly used phrase. As we think about that, a biological might be in that space. I would probably give it some time. I don't know if it's going to happen based off of our cool, wet conditions with emergence. So there's really no way, I think, to prevent the Olivo halo effect. And again, it doesn't correlate back to yield. So that biological might be used better at a strategic time to try to cope with other stresses. Just again, going back to what yield data is out there on Olivo, where PPOs aren't interacting in a pretty harsh environment in cool, wet conditions, where the beans are thriving and continuing to contribute to a good stand. I think, that Olivo effect is a stress that is, beans have a short-term memory. So it's not something we necessarily have to get too aggressive about correcting. But I still think that biological plant growth regulator conversation is definitely in the realm of a high yield bean system, however.
Okay. Which is more advantageous to planting early, fuller maturity or shorter maturity?
So I didn't give my full opinion on that. I have some insights there on the deck with the node counts of our beans and in just one location, 1 year. So again, we want to get multiple years of data, replicated trials, really truly comparing apples to apples as we think about a shorter maturity and a longer season maturity and which one to start to target those early season acres. So, where those acres are limited, it's hard to split hairs. So I think, what your operation is set up, I would definitely encourage folks to take advantage and at least give it a shot to go maybe, a full day later. compared to what you're doing today, if it fits into the comfort zone. But, we've had a lot of success and even more acres as we've, kind of brought earlier season maturities into this part of the world. There's a lot of folks in my footprint that are planting 2.6, 2.7, 2.8 beans, and they're yielding phenomenally, and they're maturing early, and we're getting timely harvest. So it's really something that I would encourage folks where they can. I know the hardest part is the harvestability of things. We don't want our 2.8s maturing and our 4.8s being green trees at the same time. However, that's what we're trying to do as a sales team in Southern Illinois, to give a little bit more data insight. And the only way we're going to know is through multiple years of data. So I kind of tiptoed around that question because I don't have a hard opinion. I would say do a little research. Dr. Belo at U of I definitely supports a fuller maturity variety. Like I said, Sean Conley, Wisconsin, he also has data that supports that in kind of a northern relative maturity zone. So I would just encourage you to trial it, but it does seem like the 4.8 could be at a higher yield potential right now in Richview, Illinois, in our trial this year.
Okay, one final question. Does the yield advantage mitigate for narrow row planting as we plant earlier?
Just so I'm understanding correctly, does the yield advantage mitigate for narrow row planting when we're planting early? Is that kind of the gist of the question?
Yep, exactly.
Okay. I would say in general, it might even be more advantageous in a wider row, like a 30-inch row. I'd say our general practice for the most part with soybeans is 15-inch rows in a high yielding system. I know some folks drill beans and have great success. I know people in 30-inch rows, especially with early planting, do have a lot of big success as well. I would say, probably in those 30-inch rows where we get a little nervous sometimes on getting the canopy closed. And so by planting earlier, in general, we're getting a little bit more branching, a little bit more vegetative growth. So I definitely say you're in a sweet spot if you're in a 15 or 20-inch row configuration. But again, with early planting, the data does suggest that there's a pretty narrow window, especially moving into like a central Illinois environment, between 15s and 30. So the early aspect probably wouldn't be a sole motivator to switch your operation one way or the other.
All right, thank you.
Is that a fair way to answer that? I didn't want to tiptoe, but there's kind of a fine line, because in places 30-inch rows are phenomenal and work, and it seems like that advantage is favored by earlier planting. So I don't think it's worth buying a new planter in lieu of that to try to be earlier or more timely.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for questions today. I want to take a moment to thank Jessica for her informative presentation, and thank you to our corporate partner DEKALB Asgrow for sponsoring today's webinar. Thank you all so much for your patience and for sticking around during our technical difficulties earlier to hear from Jessica, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. So thank you all.
Thank you all so much.